This video is going to go through a PowerPoint talking about how we go about finding patterns of meaning through our critical thinking and our critical writing. And it's important to talk about this because often when we think of writing, particularly when we think of writing for school, we think of it as something we just have to get through, something that we're being forced to do, something that we may not want to do. Now that doesn't always hold true when we're writing diaries or when we're writing stories or if we're writing a song. We don't think about writing in those ways. The ways you go about thinking about the act of writing affect often the production that you end up doing. So in particular, this talk's going to talk about academic writing, but it actually applies to any act of writing, any act of thinking that we might want to do. So I want you to imagine a box. Boxes are beautiful, aren't they? I mean, they're just one of God's greatest creations. Imagine a box. Boxes can hold things. Boxes can move materials. Boxes can hold our most precious valuables safe. But here's the thing about a box. A box can only fit so much stuff in it before it gets overwhelming, before the box itself starts to break, before we can no longer pick it up and move it because there's just too much stuff in it. You have to protect the box. Don't hurt the box. Well, I want to think about this idea of a box, and this idea of a box is a metaphor for our critical thinking processes, your critical thinking ability. And if you consider this box, you can only fit so much in it until you can no longer think effectively about that stuff. And all you have to do this is just think about the last time you were trying to write a paper, and then you had people yelling in the background, and you had text messages coming in, and you had your desire to get something done so you could do something else. All that stuff cramming into your process for critical thinking really affects your box. It can destroy it. And ultimately, if you think about this, what happens quite often with students, and with any writer really, is as they're thinking about the possibilities for writing, if they're not thinking about those possibilities in a very clear, very thought out method, what they end up doing is trying to cram too much in the box. This happens with a student who comes up with an idea to write an argumentative paper, say about the right of protesters to march in streets without state permission. They decide, okay, that's a cool idea. I want to write about Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter protests, and I want to write about the rights of those protesters to march in the streets without having to have a permit. Cool, that's awesome. But as they begin thinking about their writing more, as they begin actually sitting down in front of their paper or their computer to write, that becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So they're no longer writing about the rights of permits, but what protesters should do. They're no longer writing about what protesters do, but why they should protest. They're no longer writing about why they should protest, the injustices of society for black people in the United States. So that the stuff you're trying to cram into a box grows and grows and grows until it destroys the box. Instead, I'd like you to think about your critical thinking processes. And here, think about your topics and your evidence and your experience, all that stuff you put into a box to carry around, how you think through it, and how you develop ideas and arguments and writing through that process. Let's talk about before we get into that thinking process, let's talk about what many people do when they get a writing assignment, and that is they take a task-based writing process. So we can talk about all that writing process stuff with invention and discovery and drafting and all that, but what I'm really interested in is how we get to that end product and what kind of process we take to get there. For many, many people, when they get a writing assignment in school, they look at it as a task-based process. So what they get a task, the orange box here. They come up with a topic to fit that task, and then they start typing. That's about the extent of many people's process. processes. Now, there may be something a little bit more in here, like with your topic, maybe you develop an outline, or maybe you decide to come up with 3 different ideas, and then you start typing. But really, the whole goal here is just to get moved from task to typing. That's not a very satisfying process, and it's also not one that allows you to really develop much of a sense of what you want to say. So, I want to talk about a little bit more complex of a process. And here we're moving from a 3-step task-based process to a critical thinking and writing process that has 10 steps, where you figure out what you want to write about. What is the source of your evidence? You build some authority over that evidence. You begin to know what that evidence means. You after having that authority, you start to do some analysis, and that analysis leads you to ideas, and that ideas lead you to a pattern of meaning, and that pattern of meaning leads you to a thesis, and that thesis leads you to a plan for writing, and that plan for writing leads you to some research, and that research leads you to revising some of the previous steps, ultimately to get to the moment of writing or typing. It's a complex idea. It's an important idea because it helps to clarify what it means to move from a high school level of writing where you get a task and you just start typing to a college level of writing where you really approach this as a scholar. Let's talk about those individual boxes. Let's talk about those individual steps of the critical thinking and writing process. First, what is a source? What is this thing about a source? Well, writers have to write about things. You got to find something to put into your box, into your critical thinking process, and that thing has to become evidence. It will be the thing that you end up using in the course of writing a paper. And this is evidence, not just a topic. Often when writers are asked about what they're writing about, they're asked what their topic is. But I prefer for you to think about it as evidence. Your evidence comes from your sources. Whatever those sources are in your box, that's where you're drawing evidence from. Let's say, for instance, your teacher gives you an assignment to read a book. And from that reading of the book, you're supposed to write a book review. Well, clearly, the source there is the book. Now, the source is not what you're going to end up writing about. It is just the source of evidence where you're going to develop ideas about. There might be other sources in there, but that book becomes the primary. After developing, figuring out what that source is, you can then start to build authority within that box. You can start to pull the source out of there and look at what's going on in it and observe it, notice the details of it, reflect on what the meaning of it is, ask questions. You are having a direct experience of the thing in that box. So if you're writing a book review, a critical book review, you're going to read the book. But not just read it, think about it as a piece of evidence. What do you want to say with it? This is not such an unusual idea. Think about a scientist going out into a field to understand what the life cycle of a frog is. In order to understand that life cycle, the scientist has to observe the frog. They got to see it in its natural habitat. They've got to have direct experience seeing what's going on there. They're not yet ready to write. And one thing that often happens, and think about your own processes of writing when you get frustrated or where you get upset or you don't know what you're going to write about next. Often it's because you haven't built enough authority. You need to go back to this step. The next step is analysis. It's not enough just to have authority over something. It's not enough just to know what's in there. You've got to be able to analyze it, to figure out how it was built. If we go back to the frog, pulling apart that frog, dissecting it, cutting it open, seeing how the musculature works and the lungs work and all the other parts of the frog works, you have to be able to analyze what's going on in that thing. In the case of a book review, you've got to define the terms. You've got to ask questions of what you're reading. You've got to think about what were the cause and effects, not only of the story itself, but of how it was written. You've got to do rhetorical analysis. Who is the author? Why are they writing? What's their authority? Who's the audience? How are they being appealed to? And maybe you do an analytical technique based on your identity lens. You want to look at something through the lens of race or gender or sexuality or religion or politics. You have a particular lens through which you look at this book. Again, analysis is different than authority, which is different than just knowing what's your source. These are steps in a process. After having done some analysis, broken something down, and really worked out how and why it was meaningful, you will probably find that you develop some ideas. Those ideas are going to be good ideas and cynical ideas and mundane ideas and silly ideas, passionate ideas and negative ideas and serious ideas and simple ideas and undeveloped ideas, and so on. These were all binaries, but I split them all apart. You're going to have lots and lots of ideas. And what I would recommend with those ideas is that you get paper and actually work with pen and paper here. And you're scribbling those ideas out, sometimes in a very organized fashion, sometimes in bullet points, sometimes in just writing all over a piece of paper. Recognizing your ideas and spending time on your ideas, working them out, is a really important and overlooked part of the writing process, of the critical thinking process. Because when we're taught it in school with those 5 steps to the writing process, we're taught just to write some stuff down to generate ideas. But what we really miss there is the value of having bad ideas, the value of allowing yourself the freedom of creating ideas that are not productive at all. All those ideas are necessary in order to know how your ideas are forming. These cards here, by the way, are postcards of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s notes when he was giving his farewell address at the Dexter Avenue Church. Oh, sorry, wrong way. Why is it necessary to have those ideas? Why is it necessary to record them, pay attention to them? Well, because maybe if you can do that, you can start to build a sense of your patterns of meaning. A good idea, how it's connected to a mundane idea, how it's connected to a positive idea, how it's connected to a developed idea, which is connected to a unique idea, which is connected to a negative idea, which is connected to a good idea. By writing all those ideas out, think about it in terms of a review. You have an idea about the author, you have an idea about the subject, you have an idea about one of the characters, you have an idea about something that happened. And writing all those ideas out and seeing how they work together on a paper, you might be able to connect those ideas in meaningful ways. This pattern of meaning idea comes from John Trimber, who is a scholar of composition and writing, and he actually established this idea in a textbook called Call to Write, which is what we started this course with. The call to write means that you have something that is making you want to write, something that is calling you to write at this moment. And for a writer who's working through an idea, that call to write is often the pattern of meaning. It's like a slot machine moment. A ding, 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 ding. There it is. I know what it is. I know what I've got to say. And in terms of scholarship, that pattern of meaning is really essential. When doing academic writing, college-level writing, when trying to produce new ideas in the world, a pattern of meaning matters because it is something unique and powerful, and it comes from you. And as a responsible scholar in the world, you now have a responsibility to share that pattern of meaning because you have found it through ideas and analysis and authority over a source that you have carefully selected. Here's what's really essential about this too. We can all start with a singular source. We're all going to read a book together. We're all going to talk about that book together. We're going to work through it together. We're all got this one source. But you know, the way that you develop your authority over that source and the way that I develop my authority over that source really depends on who we are as people. I am a middle-aged, middle-class white man. I'm well educated. I grew up in the South and I grew up in the North. I play poker and I read comic books. I love punk music and I love country music. all of those different aspects of who I am affects the way that I read this book, the way I see what's in that box. Just like the aspects of who you are will affect what you see in that box, which affects how you build your authority. Our ways of thinking, our patterns of analysis, what you like to look at is different than what I like to look at. When my wife and I will watch a movie together, I'll often break down the narrative structure and the stories. It really annoys her, and she likes to just think about whether or not the movie had truth in it. There's nothing wrong with the way that she does it. There's nothing wrong with the way I do it. It is built out of our different skills and our different areas of study. Those different types of analysis lead to different ideas. Now, actually, we may share some same ideas. If we looked at my scribbles on a sheet of paper and I looked at your scribbles, we might see some similar ideas. But here's where the unique part is. When we start to connect those ideas into patterns of meaning based on what our ideas were, how we developed our analysis, what our authority is, what we saw in that source, when we each start to connect our ideas, we are going to connect them in very different ways. Our meanings are going to develop in very different ways. This is the powerful idea behind writing. That it's necessary for both you and I to write about the same book, about the same topic, about the same source of information, because our meanings are going to be very different. And when you write your meaning and I write my meaning, those meanings are going to come together in discourse, and we're going to talk about what those meanings mean. That's where writing has power. We're only halfway through that critical thinking and writing process. The rest of it is more of a general idea of writing. That is, you have to articulate your meaning. You've got to figure out what you want to say, and you do that generally through a thesis or a major point or a claim. This is where the discussion of developing a thesis statement comes in. Once you know what you want to say, you've got to articulate it. You've got to come up with a way to state it that establishes your meaning for other people. And again, we've got Martin Luther King Jr. here, preaching from the pulpit, establishing his meaning that he had developed through his process. Once you've got that meaning established, you can then start to go through it in a detailed process of writing, starting with planning, establishing a thesis statement, developing an outline, figuring out what specific points you're going to want to prove in that outline, and then from that outline noticing gaps and holes in your argument where you want to go do some extra research, some people to back you up, and then maybe from that research figuring out that you got to do some revision and you want to go back and do some previous steps in the process. All of that work may then lead you to drafting. Writing the paper. It's not like this whole process is, I'm going to stop this just in case it's causing anybody to have seizures. It's not like this whole process happens A, B, C, D, E. Step 1, 2, 3. We actually do all these different things at different points at different times in our writing, but by laying it out this way, it helps us see that writing is not as simple as task, topic, typing. That writing for school is much more complex than that, but I would say any type of writing. If you can recognize the process of critical thinking and critical writing, you will become much more effective at doing those things, which means recognizing that writing doesn't happen without understanding revision. And revision doesn't happen without understanding how research and other people's ideas impact you. And research doesn't happen without planning to know what you want to say and when you want to say it. And planning doesn't happen unless you have a thesis. And a thesis can't happen unless you have a pattern of meaning. And a pattern of meaning won't grow out of anything unless you've got ideas. And ideas won't have any substance unless they're based on analysis. And analysis has no meaning in the world unless it's based on an authority that you've built over a specific subject, a source of evidence that you've selected. It's pretty easy to get lost in this process. it's pretty easy to get tired of this process and do what many people do, which is to say, I don't want to think about all that. I don't want to put all that effort into it. I'm just going to figure out my task and type my paper. But I can promise you that if you can get comfortable with this process, a few things are going to happen. One, you're going to feel better about your writing. You're going to feel better about your power. You're going to see more responsibility in your writing. Two, you're not going to get to the top of page 2 without some recognition of why you're getting stuck there. You're going to have a better understanding of what you need to do in order to develop a text that has meaning for other people. And 3, you're just going to become more of a professional and more of a scholar. By recognizing your own thinking and writing processes, you become better at producing meaningful work so that what you end up is not just typing, but you end up creating a pattern of meaning within the world. I hope you find that helpful. I hope that talk helps you think more about the current project that you're working on, whether it's a book review, a research paper, or a commentary, or any other type of writing. Take care.